description.
Shadiversity.
Greetings, I'm Shad, and on my YouTube channel I've talked a lot about swords, because swords are awesome, but in addition to swords I've talked a lot about shields, knights, armour, castles, chivalry, medieval combat, but I haven't yet addressed in depth archery, which is quite an oversight. So let's fix that and let's get into it. Now in this video I'm going to be looking at the comparative differences between modern day archery and historical archery, and how that by necessity creates certain limitations and also differences in the style or way that it was done. The bow that you're seeing me hold here would, by most modern considerations, be considered a more traditional bow, because there's quite a lot of differences between this bow and a modern day target recurve. This bow here is what you'd kind of find in modern day sport archery, and yes, there's a couple of key differences between the two. But even on this more traditional wooden bow, this is not the type of bow that you would find in the medieval period, or even for many times after it, and of course before then as well. But what are the differences on this bow compared to a historical bow? Well, what you'll notice, if I hold it up on the side here, it has a cutout right here. Let me get closer and I'll show you. So if I bring it up here, do you see this indent on the shaft of the bow? This is to solve a thing called the archer's paradox. On a regular bow, its shaft would actually be in the way of the arrow. And when the arrow gets loosed, it actually has a natural curve or oscillation where it curves around the shaft and keeps moving forward. But it does create an interesting issue where the arrow is vibrating and oscillating quite a lot as this moves forward. Now, a bow that has this kind of design, which is basically the standard, even up to modern day bows that have additional features on it like sights and stabilizers. And you'll notice, even with the differences, if I bring it forward, hopefully you'll be able to see it, it has a cutout right here, just like this one as well. This type of design helps reduce the vibration or oscillation that an arrow receives in flight, but it doesn't get rid of it completely. You never will. But it certainly helps with accuracy. So even though this bow is considered more traditional on the standard, view of recurve bows, it is not completely traditional. A completely true, traditional longbow is going to have just a single shaft straight all the way down, and you have to deal with the archer's paradox. That's one of the issues. But you have to deal with other issues that actually would still exist even on this bow, that modern bows have been adapted or upgraded to try and solve. But before I speak about what those limitations are, I want to point out a style, okay, an actual type or archery style that this type of bow almost necessitates. And it's the side in which you load your arrow. Now, of course, I could still fire this bow with the arrow on the right side, but it's kind of awkward. If I kind of show you, do you see the angle in which the arrow is getting pointed off? Like that's what's happening, okay? It's getting pointed off on the side because not only is the shaft in the way, there's more meat on this side pushing the arrow further out. It's not just a straight shaft. So this design actually makes right-sided archery shooting even more difficult than if it was just a plain shaft. But in terms of left-side loading, well, that's perfectly fine. But this raises an interesting question. Did archers always load the arrow on the right side? Now, if you've seen anything about archery on YouTube, there's a very high chance you've seen a video made by Lars Anderson, which talks about certain historical claims and also shows very impressive trick shooting. And whatever anyone says about Lars Anderson, he is a master when it comes to trick shooting. But that's not necessarily 100% historical shooting, but it also doesn't mean it's not 0% historical shooting either. There's enough evidence to show that arrows have been loaded on both the right side and the left side in historical archery. So what determines when you would want to load it on the left side as opposed to the right side? Well, there are both advantages and disadvantages with each technique, which is why historically both techniques were used depending on the preferences of the individual archer. But in regards to modern day shooting, left side loading has become the standard for a very important reason. It has higher capacity to render increased accuracy at long distance. And the reasons for this are very logical. When you load an arrow on the left side and you draw it all the way up to, your mouth, you're able to look directly down the shaft of the arrow without any obstructions in the way between the back of the arrow to the front. This helps line up your shot and aim. Now, can this be overcome if you were to load the arrow on the right side? With practice, yes, but you always got the issue of the of the bow being in the way of your shot. So if loading the arrow on the left side has greater potential for accuracy, and pay attention to my words when I say this, has greater potential for accuracy, okay? If you practice enough, a well-experienced right side loading archer can be far more accurate than someone who's only intermediately practiced in archery who loads on the left traditional side. And I say traditional only because that's what the modern day is. As to what was more prevalent, there's no way to tell. All we know is that both left side and right side loading was done. Yet having said that, if loading an arrow on the left side of the bow has greater potential for accuracy on the higher kind of tiers of skill, why did anyone load it on the right side? Well, for a very significant factor that is actually not an issue or a consideration in regards to modern day archery, because you will notice in regards to modern day target archery, they always shoot on the left side, so much so that the standard design of nearly every single bow these days are built to accommodate left side loading. What am I talking about? I'm talking about the speed of reloading. In regards to modern day target archery, you have all the time in the world to load your arrow, set your shot, draw, aim, and fire, and then you're under no pressure to reload to take your second shot. But historically, especially if you're using the bow in a combat situation, firing quickly a second and third and as many times as possible is very, very important, especially if you have some guy trying to charge you with a sword with the intent to kill you. Therefore, wanting to nock your arrow quickly, and including the second and consecutive arrows that you're going to shoot, that's a very big priority. Now, in terms of what enables you to reload or just load in the first place at a fast rate is very much determined in which hand you're holding the bow. Most people are right-handed. Even in modern day rifle shooting, the people usually mount their rifle on their right side. So if you're holding the bow with your left hand and loading it with your right, this creates some interesting biomechanical issues, because the arrow, if it's going to be loaded on the left side, yet the hand you're loading with is on the right side, well, there's something in the way of the arrow that you're trying to load. It's the bow itself. The very position of your hand on the string is still going to be on the right side, but you need to mount the arrow on the left side of the bow. Do you see the problem here? So even after you load your arrow and you have it nocked, guess what side my hand is on? My hand is actually on the left side. So I've got to bring my hand around to the side that I'm drawing with to draw back and then fire. There is a couple of ways to solve this issue if you still want to load the arrow on the left side to get the advantages of being able to line up your shot all the way down the shaft of the arrow. And one of the ways to fix this is to mount your quiver on your back. This is very significant because by having the quiver positioned on my right side, my hand is already there ready to grab the arrows, which is convenient, but after I grab it, I still need to load it on this side. So if the quiver was on my back, and by necessity I have to pull it out from here, suddenly by just angling my bow a little bit this way, as soon as I bring the arrow down, guess which side it's on? It's on the right side it needs to be drawn back and shot. And just to bring up that in the flow of recording this video, I forgot to mention a fairly significant advantage to having a quiver mounted on your back, so I'll quickly mention it just here. And it's that once you draw an arrow to loose, the hand that drew the string back is more often than not going to be positioned near your face if you shoot in this style. This means that the position of the hand that needs to draw the next arrow is far closer to arrows that would be mounted in a quiver on your back than opposed to arrows that are hung at your hip. The hand needs to move a shorter distance to draw the next arrow and load it when it's on your back, which facilitates faster reloading. So by having the quiver on the back, it actually creates a biomechanical situation in which you can load the bow and reload faster if you're shooting on the left side. There is another limitation to this type of loading though, because even if you draw the arrow from the quiver and load it, guess which side my hand is still on? Still on the left side, and to draw it, I need to be on this. But interestingly enough, there is a technique that solves it, and it's a reverse grip. Instead of drawing the bow back like this, you can switch your grip make it upside down and draw it back. Now guess which side of the string or bow my hit is on. It's on the same side that it's shooting, which can then make shooting and reloading the arrow so much quicker. If I just load it like this, I'm suddenly good to go. One of the other famous YouTube videos about speed shooting, which is speed shooting on the left side of the bow, and it's this wonderful lady, I don't know her name, I probably should do research, but anyway, this wonderful lady here. Have a look how she is loading the bow. What's her grip position on it? Reverse, all the way like that. So you might think, well, there you go, that solves the problem. That's why the back quiver was so popular, and so it's going with certain advantages over certain disadvantages. Now, not necessarily, because with every gain, there's kind of a bit of a loss. And so we've already talked about the gain, about reverse grip, like holding your hand like this, and aiming and shooting, which you can, do perfectly adequately, like aim and stuff. But there is an issue, again, a biomechanical issue with this position. It uses a different muscle set as soon as you twist it over. And you can give it a go. If you have a bow, try drawing your bow like that compared to drawing it like that. When I draw it in the more standard way, or the more conventional way, I can feel my back muscles engaging to a more efficient and effective degree than when I switch my grip. And in fact, I'm using different forearm muscles as well, holding the grip. So there's a number of different issues about that. This can be a problem when you're shooting with a very high poundage of bow. Now, poundage is referring to how much weight you're actually pulling back, or force you're pulling back when you draw the bow. High poundage, harder to draw back. Therefore, with the higher poundage kind of war bows that were used on historical battlefields, a reverse grip isn't going to be the best thing for you, especially if you've ever tried to pull back a very high-powered bow. It's amazing. It's a really unique experience, feeling the burning sensation behind your back. So the poundage of bow is actually a very strong indicator, or help you out determine, according to your own preferences, what side of the bow you can load and how fast to reload and other things like that. If you're shooting the higher poundage bows, now historically, if you're wanting a war bow, average would be around 80 to 100 pounds. That's huge, okay? My target bow, 35 pounds. This one, I need to get re-weighed because I think it's closer to 50 or 60. And 60 pounds is considered high in regards to the standard draw weights of bows these days, which is actually quite low in regards to when war bows. Now, funny, there's a scale of war bows. I'm talking about the kind of standard classic English longbows or war bows. Well then yes, 80 to 100 pound. But they even got up higher to 150, and in most rare cases, 180 pounds, which is insane. If you are dealing with bows of such an extreme level of draw, all right, chances are you are never going to be drawing it with a reverse grip. You need to engage all your muscles to really pull it back, which means you're going to be doing a conventional, or what has become conventional side, and you get the added advantages of being able to aim down the shaft. But there is another method of fast reloading or loading in regards to a bow in which you can use the conventional grip, not reverse grip, conventional. So if you're using a higher poundage of bow, this technique might be quite useful. And yes, it is loading and shooting the arrow on the right side of the bow shaft. When it comes to loading the arrow on the right side of the shaft, well, you can still have a back quiver and load it that way, but you would need to angle your bow, a bit on this side to load it, which can make aiming rather restrictive, and it places the shaft of the bow in your line of sight. So that's why, angling the bow this way is always better, because you can line up the shot with your thing. But if it's on the left side, you might want to do that anyway, and aim kind of like this. Or you could have the quiver on your hip. Now, interesting thing about that is it's on the right side of your hand, like so where your hand is, so it's already there ready to go, and you can just draw, shoot, I lost an arrow, draw, and it's already in the right position to pull back and fire. There's an additional technique that gives added advantage to shooting on the left side of the bow, and that's being able to hold additional arrows in the hand ready to shoot, and you don't need to pull them out of the quiver. This is one of the things that Lars Anderson points out. Now, the claim that this is how it was always done, no, that's incorrect. But the claim that it was done in certain times and circumstances, and there are certain inherent advantages to that, Absolutely, but there are also disadvantages that need to be pointed out. Arrow on the right side means you can't line up the shaft as easily, and so for shooting pinpoint accuracy at far distances, you already have enough limitations in traditional archery, which I'll talk about, and this just adds an additional one on top of that, so it's not a style you might pick if you're trying to shoot at far distances. But for the quickest rapid fire in archery, I think Lars Andersen has shown in some pretty impressive ways how advantageous it can be in holding several arrows in the hand that you're loading it with. Doesn't mean speed shooting can't be done on the left side, but back quiver, reverse kind of grip is the best setup to be able to do that with rapid succession.
There's another significant limitation in holding arrows with your loading hand, and it's that you can only hold a certain amount of arrows. So no matter how fast you're able to fire those arrows that you're holding, you are still going to need to draw additional arrows from a quiver. And this brings up the advantages and disadvantages of the quiver's positioning. A back quiver will position those arrows closer to the drawing hand, and you'd be able to draw out several at a time. But of course, firing arrows on the more conventional or left side of the bow is biomechanically more efficient when you are drawing arrows from a quiver on your back.
Now, does this mean having a quiver at your hip was done only when you would be shooting the arrow on the right side of the bow? Absolutely not. There are certain other advantages with having the quiver on the hip, and one of them is convenience. I've been walking around my house setting up this video, and I tell you, just having this here, very easy to get it in and out of doorways and stuff like that. Now, I have another quiver that I used when I was a kid, and of course it's a back quiver because everyone wanted to be Robin Hood, or I wanted to be Robin Hood. In fact, it was after I watched Robin Hood Prince of Thieves and I got totally obsessed with it that I got my first bow. So yes, I had it on my back, and I tell you what, look, it doesn't go to the level of comical awkwardness that Lars Andersen kind of shows in this video, but it is more awkward than having it at your hip, especially when you start to load it up with a lot of arrows. So of course there are a lot of advantages with quiver at your hip, and even if you're shooting on the left side, if speed or of reload isn't nearly as much of an option, or say you're shooting in large volleys with an army, and look, you can load it relatively quick and fire, so if you train and practice, you still can shoot much faster than someone who hasn't practiced, even with a quiver at your hip. So of course, it still can be done. I'm not saying it wasn't, I'm just trying to point out the inherent advantages and disadvantages in these different setups. So you've probably noticed that it's an intriguing balance between the draw weight of the bow, how accurate you need to be, also how far a distance you're shooting, and how quickly you want to reload. All these elements is going to play a very significant role into the technique or style of archery that historical archers would have employed.
And saying that there was only one style of archery that was ever used historically, or one style that was most common or most popular, is very incorrect. As well as saying one of these stylistic preferences in archery technique is superior to all other styles. It's a matter of context and the circumstances that the individual archers are facing in the way that they employ archery as a whole. So back quiver, side quiver, left arrow, right arrow, conventional grip, reverse grip, these are all a matter of individual preference.
And to finish this video off, I want to talk about one of the more contrasting differences between really modern day target shooting. And so when I say that, I'm referring to this type of bow right here, with stabilizers and sights and all the bells and whistles. Now, even though it's got a cutout like this, like my more traditional wooden bow, it is still quite the different beast. And my traditional bow, even though it's not a perfectly historical one due to its cutout, but even though it's not perfectly historically accurate, it still comes with the same inherent limitations that historical bows had, separate to the archer's paradox. And I'll mention what those are right now. In modern day target archery, it's all about pinpoint accuracy, getting as close to center as you possibly can. Dead center, as the saying goes. So, not just hitting the bullseye, but getting close to the very center. That always seems to be a better shot in people's minds, dead center, than just getting it within the limit of the central ring. Now, that level of pinpoint accuracy absolutely would be advantageous for the historical archer, but to get to that level at far distances, that's when you need some of the, additional bells and whistles on the bow. Because a bow like this has inherent weaknesses, and one of them is drift and also vibration, okay? Unless you're an absolute superhuman, no matter who you are, especially when you draw it back, you're going to be shaking it just a little bit. Now, Do you see how I'm even holding the bow? Okay, I'm not gripping it firmly, I'm holding it like that. This is a technique that has arisen to reduce, again, vibration and shaking when you pull back, because if you're gripping it tough, it increases it. And of course, the longer you're holding back the string, the more vibration that occurs. Because of this, there is an inherent inaccuracy to traditional archery that you simply can't avoid. It comes from being a human being. And of course, when the arrow drifts just a millimeter here, that means a difference of meters at far distances. And so for the historical archer that's trying to shoot someone at a far distance, it's not a matter of trying to hit them through the eye slit if it's a knight or, in the weak points of armor. It's just a matter of hitting them, period. Modern day target bows are engineered in a very sophisticated manner to enhance the possible accuracy that you can get out of this system, the bow and arrow system. One of the first things you'll notice are these strange rods that are sticking out of the bow. These are called stabilizers, and they do very much what the name implies. They stabilize the bow. How? Simple principles of inertia. When your hand wants to shake the bow, okay, if there's more weight located around where you're holding it, that means it's going to take more energy to keep the bow shaking at a very large rate. And the position of these stabilizers also helps, stabilize it on that plane. So I'm talking about rotation along this axis and also rotation along this axis. These rods simply make it that more energy is required to make the bow shake when you draw back. And I tell you what, just drawing it back right here compared to my other bow is so much more stable. I can feel it. The other thing is the weight is extended away from the shaft. Now, when you're holding the bow like this, it has a very noticeable forward tilt. But when you draw it, and I'm hitting my bow, that tilt balances out where it's perfectly even. This prevents a natural desire for the bow to want to drift upwards when you're drawing it back. And this, of course, enhances overall stability. And when you're really wanting to hit dead center at a target that's pretty far away, you need that additional stability. You just can't achieve it without these additional features. And then on top of that, I have this nifty little thing, a sighting right there. But it's not like a rifle, because the other thing about arrows is that they naturally arc, and further distance, more of the arc. And so if you're shooting at something further away, you have to accommodate for that and aim a little bit higher to account for the arc and get the arrow to hit the target. You don't get any of that with a traditional bow like this. And like I said, this isn't a purely historical traditional because of the cutout, but it has those other limitations that I've just mentioned. What this means is historical archery, medieval archery, is not as accurate as modern day target archery. It's biomechanically impossible just by virtue of how the human body is set up and also how the bow is set up. Unless someone is like a superhuman and they can reduce that vibration and drift just because they're so good at it. But then you would also have the same issue of the archer's paradox and the natural oscillation of the arrow in flight. But accuracy wasn't necessarily as severe a thing in the medieval period because the human body is a much larger target than the bullseye on a target. And especially with medieval medical technology, just hitting them anywhere like on the torso, let alone, forget about the limbs. If you just hit a human body in the torso, there's a very high chance of piercing an internal organ, and that pretty much means death. Internal bleeding and infection, very hard to deal with in the medieval period. So they didn't have to hit someone in the eye, they just had to hit them, period, and that was just as good a shot as they could hope for. So in that sense, pinpoint dead center accuracy wasn't nearly as needed, and being accurate within that realm of acceptable variance in accuracy, it's actually much more, I guess, possible or easy than it is to hit dead center in a target that's at equivalent. And when I say long distances, we're looking around, 70 meters and above. And in regards to that, like I mentioned before, hitting them, period, is equivalent to a bullseye in this realm. And there we go. These have been the differences between historical archery and modern day archery. It was high time that I tackled this subject. I hope you've enjoyed, and I do hope to see you again. Until that time, farewell. And I'm just going to load it and pull back because it looks cool, but of course, I'm not going to shoot it because I'm inside. Okay, Jon Snow, I'm going to pull back my bow and aim it at you and then have a really long conversation. But the thing is, I'm nowhere near as strong as you grit, and I'm already starting to struggle. I can feel it, so I'm kind of timing myself how long I can hold the string back. And I'm shaking. Oh gosh, I'm shaking. Oh, do you see it? The burn! I'm feeling the burn! Ugh. Okay, I don't want to hurt myself. If I tried to keep, I could have gone longer, but there's a chance I might have even injured myself if I pushed myself even further. Now, of course, somebody who does archery far, much more than me, like does it regularly every week, because I don't do it every week. I still love it. They'd be able to hold back a bow for much, much longer. But that was just, to point out that stupid thing in movies where you have girls holding back bows for really extended periods of time. And in regards to bows, I've talked about this in other videos, it's all upper body strength, people. You can, and back, the back. So there you go. That was about as long as I could hold back this bow, but I don't even know the true poundage of this bow, so it doesn't mean anything in the end, I guess. Ugh. I'm dripping with sweat. I'm wearing a gambeson in Australian summer, so it's a traditional archers wore gambeson. It's for the effect, all right?